Joining me live in the studio is the Independent Senator David Pocock. Lots to talk to you about today. Let's start with the government's superannuation tax change. Do you support that?
Hi, Kieran. Yeah, good to be with you. I think this is really sensible. If you have a few $1 million tucked away in super, I don't understand why you should continue to get really generous tax concessions. And, unfortunately, I think this is something that people get so frustrated with is policy like this that I think most politicians in private on all sides would say, yeah, that's sensible. But then we see the politics being played and it makes it harder to have these sorts of, I think, really important, sensible conversations on a whole range of other issues.
Do you think that it should be extended? The government says it wants to extend it to defined benefits. That is the generous superannuation that many public servants, former judges, and some of the politicians that have been here for more than a couple of decades that are on the old system, they're still on the defined benefits, and it's a very generous superannuation scheme. Would you like to see the government achieve that aim of including the Prime Minister's own?
I'm not across that bit of it. Yeah, as an independent, I'll look at the proposal and consult and judge it on its merits. So. Yeah.
But the generosity of, if you've got a healthy superannuation balance of over 3 million, you think that's fair game?
Absolutely. If the average Australian has 150 grand in super, why do you need more than 3 million? And how do you even get 3 million into there to start with? This is a generous tax concession to a relatively small number of people. And you look at the savings, you're talking $1-2 billion at a time where there's genuine need in our communities, cost of living, housing. We're busy legislating this Housing Australia Future Fund. We need more housing. Not to mention, mental health support, all of these things that people desperately want but take money. There's a $1-2 billion every year that could be directed to those sorts of things.
And would you like the government now to be more ambitious in some of these saves? The Prime Minister today ruled out touching the capital gains tax exemption on the family home. The Treasurer didn't do it immediately, but did a few hours later.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a good call? Where should they look for further saves?
I don't think going after people's family home is something that any politician is going to do. It's not something I would support. But when it comes to investment properties, having one investment property, I think, is very different to getting tax breaks on your 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th investment property. And that costs a lot of money. So the frustration with the way that this is blown up into this big sort of finger-pointing exercise between the major parties, despite, I think, it being a fairly sensible move, means that when it comes to things like housing policy, which I think most people, if you sit down and talk it through and look at options like this, they're not 2 or 3 million. I think is very generous. If you capped capital gains tax discount and negative gearing at 2 properties, that allows people who maybe don't have super to invest in property, but it stops people getting these generous tax breaks, that everyone has to then foot the bill for.
So you'd like to see some further moves on the investment property front. Let's talk about the safeguard mechanism now, because I know you've been in talks with the Minister about that. That's the climate policy. The Greens are still suggesting they might vote against this, which would be another time the Greens would vote against a climate policy in this place. What's your view on it?
I mean, how they negotiate is up to them. I'm not approaching this with red lines. I've hosted a couple of roundtables, spent 2 days at the Senate committee hearings. It's a big, really important piece of our climate policy. The 215 biggest emitters in Australia. It's so important we get it right. So, I'm committed to working constructively. Minister Bowen, over the last 6 months, has said he's open to sensible suggestions and amendments, and I'll continue to do that. I think as it stands, it definitely needs some work. It needs some work to ensure that it does what it's setting out to do, which is to bring emissions down in that sector.
Do you think it's too generous with offsets for the heavy emitters to help offset their own emissions?
So the design as it currently is, there is no limit to the number of offsets that you can use to carbon credits you can use to offset your emissions. Australia would join Kazakhstan as the two countries in the world that allow that. Every other country that has some sort of mechanism like this sets a limit, because what you really want to be doing is incentivising companies to avoid emitting and then to reduce their emissions on site, and then as a last resort to be offsetting. Having open access to carbon credits doesn't necessarily do that. The other question that I was really trying to understand at these Senate committee hearings is that there's a price cap of $75, but it's really unclear what happens if the price goes above $75 and the government doesn't have carbon credits, ACCUs, that they can then sell at $75.
Right.
My concern is that the Commonwealth is then on the hook for that, whatever gap it is. If it's $100, that's $25 for every single carbon credit.
Yeah.
These are the details that I'm really keen to keep working through and better understand it.
But you're inclined to support it, given the lack of climate policy for a fair while, and certainly from the Greens since 2009 when they opposed the Rudd carbon price. Things haven't been smooth sailing.
I think there's a lot to work through at this stage. We've seen an initial proposal. I'm assuming with all the submissions that they've had in the 2 days of hearings, there will be some changes to that. So this is a.
So you've still got a fair bit to work through before you get there.
I think there's a fair bit of work to do, but in principle, we have to ensure that we get this right. That's the main thing for me.
Independent Senator David Pocock, as always, thanks.
Thanks, Kieran.